Hello, hola. I'm Sara Alvarez and I'm with Manatee County Parks and Natural Resources.
I'm Jeff Moates. I'm a Regional Director for the Florida Public Archaeology Network.
And we're here today at Perico Preserve to trace the footprints of some of Manatee County's earliest settlements, Cuban Ranchos. Estamos aquí en la Reserva de Perico para seguir las huellas de una de las comunidades más antiguas aquí en Manatee County, los ranchos cubanos. What evidence have we found of Cuban ranchos? ¿Qué evidencia hemos encontrado de los ranchos cubanos?
We historians believe that, maybe these fishing stations or ranchos as they became known may have started as early as the 1500s in Florida. So as Spanish conquistadors or Spanish raiders or Spanish explorers were working their way into the New World to exploit goods and people and all the things that they came over here for, realized that they needed to supply these kind of fleets with lots of food and fresh fish and whatnot on their journeys across the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. So this was a good way to supply these ships with lots of protein-rich foods for those long journeys. But ultimately, the ranchos became a thing that we know a little bit later on, or more well known as these ranchos became a thing later on into the 1700s, when the colonial port of Havana was settled and population was really expanding there. Fishermen from Cuba, fisher folk from Cuba, realized that they could run up to Florida, catch the fish in a seasonal capacity, and then bring it back down to Cuba to trade at market, but also to supply a lot of these fleets and a lot of these ships. So that's where the ranchos really got their start, and they got their start on a seasonal basis. Florida is, as we all know, is rich estuary, nearshore estuarine communities, and so there's lots of nearshore and schooling fish that they could take advantage of, primarily mullet, pompano, mackerel. Things like that could be easily caught in nets and then salted and brought back down to Cuba. So it was seasonal at first. The fisher folk would come up mainly in the late fall and the early winter to make their catch and then procure using salt, to salt the fish to then transport back down to Cuba. And they supplied, really the height of the market was kind of right at the late winter, early spring, which is the Lent season, the Catholic religious tradition. In the early summer and fall, these were people who lived on the water, so they realized when hurricane season was in the Caribbean Basin and the in the Atlantic Ocean. So for most of the summer and the early fall, they spent their time procuring salt for the colonial government, but also for their own exploits and for their own purposes, and fixing gear and fixing boats during that time, and then would make the trip back, late fall to catch the big mullet run again. And so that occurred all the way up to about the 1780s, and then once you hit the 1780s, it signals kind of a change in how these operations really set forth. They became more year-round occupations, and so we get some really large rancho operations in Charlotte Harbor, but of course they expanded all the way up the Gulf Coast as far as Tampa Bay, and then even on the East Coast there's some known ranchos and rancho occupations as far north as Jupiter Inlet.
Jeff menciona que aquí en Manatee County podemos encontrar dos tipos de evidencia. Está la evidencia arqueológica y está la evidencia escrita en nuestra historia. La presencia de los ranchos viene desde los 1500, cuando los españoles paraban en la Florida para suplementar sus dietas con pescado y otras cosas que encontraban en nuestras costas. Después los cubanos empezaron a venir estacionalmente y tenían comunidades durante las temporadas de pesca. Y ya al principio de 1780, habían comunidades permanentes y estables aquí en la Florida de ranchos cubanos. Y no solamente existían los pescadores cubanos, también habían nativos o indígenas ya que estaba la presencia de los Calusa y hasta los Seminole. Y también se encontraban esclavos fugitivos que habían escapado de muchas de las plantaciones en los alrededores. So the name of our preserve is Perico, and Perico was actually a big rancho owner in the area, isn't that right? So can you tell us more about Perico Pompon and other notable ranchos? Perico es el nombre de nuestra reserva y era uno de los dueños de uno de los ranchos más notables en el área. ¿Nos puedes decir un poco más sobre la historia de Perico Pompon y otros ranchos?
Perico is an interesting and somewhat of a mysterious figure in the Rancho period. You know, the largest and most well-known ranchos really originate down in the Charlotte Harbor area. But there's some notable ranchos here, and Perico was really kind of instrumental in both of the areas and kind of rancho operations. We know that Perico Pompon was a fisherman down in Charlotte Harbor and operated in some of, and may have even, you know, been part owner, sharing in the profits of some of the larger ranchos down there. He filed for a Spanish land grant that was never really certified, I guess, but it was backed up by some other of the rancho owners. And he was down there as early as 1815, and we know that through historical records. But then eventually he showed up here, and he was working somewhere at the mouth of the Manatee River or somewhere in Tampa Bay. It's still somewhat of a mystery. We don't know where he and his family lived, but it's likely that they lived here on the island that is named after him. I mean, that makes the most sense. But he was working alongside two other fishermen primarily, and they really helped settle what has become Bradenton or Manatee County. They kind of ushered in and guided some of the first white settlers to the Manatee Village, or the village of Manatee, in the 1840s. So they were really instrumental in the settlement of this place. And by 1835, Perico Pompon was working with one of the other notable kind of rancho owners, a gentleman from Maryland, who was a shipping agent and worked down in Key West, and surely that's where he became really familiar with these fisher folk that operated the ranchos. And his name is William Bunce, and we can talk about him a little later. But Perico was a fixture in really the rancher operations up and down the coast for the early part of the 19th century there.
Perico fue un pescador proveniente de Charlotte Harbor, viviendo allí desde los 1815. Eventualmente se mudó aquí al río Manatee y se cree que su rancho estuvo en esta isla, llamada por el pescador apropiadamente Perico. Aquí trabajó con otros pescadores como William Bunce y ayudó a los primeros ciudadanos blancos de Bradenton. Así se convirtió en uno de los dueños de ranchos más importantes de la época.
We took a short detour to Desoto National Park to visit the ruins of William Bunce's rancho. Nos desviamos un momento al Parque Nacional de Desoto para visitar las ruinas del famoso rancho de William Bunce.
We're here at Desoto Point for the longest time. It's called Desoto Point now. It's Desoto National Memorial, but it's historically was known as Shaw's Point. There was a family of settlers, the Shaw family, who lived here beginning in about 1843, and then left in 1856 and moved back down to, or headed out and moved to Key West. But this is the site of what we believe to be probably a series of occupations by rancho owners and operators, and most notable is this is probably the location where William Bunce started out in 1834. William Bunce was a shipping agent originally from Maryland and spent a lot of time in Key West, and that's really where he obviously became familiar with the rancho trade, the Cuban trade, and also the individuals and the families who were operating that trade. In 1834, he set up shop here, likely here at the mouth of the Manatee River, and there were probably, it was probably a continually occupied location for ranchos, and William Bunce just took advantage of the location and really kind of headquartered his operations for a couple of years. From here, he moved to what's most likely Mullet Keys at the north of the entrance, the north side of the entrance to Tampa Bay. But it's here where he got his start, and this is where he was working with the likes of Perico Pompon and some other fishermen and families. The Tabby ruins, which you can see here, are a really interesting feature to this whole time period. There have been some archaeological investigations that the Southeastern Archaeological Center that operates the archaeological services for the National Park Service have done some work here in the past, and most recently in 2016. And what they've uncovered is evidence of all of that rancho operation. It's hard to tell, it's hard to say who exactly built this tabby structure, but a tabby is a type of old-timey concrete. It's a mixture of sand, lime, shell, crushed shell and burnt shell, and water, and it forms this hard material or concrete. And a lot of the early structures around Florida, and especially in this area, were made of this type of material. So it's difficult to pinpoint exactly who built it. It's most likely associated with the Shaw settlement, but it could be a little bit earlier than that. And so a lot of the archaeological evidence points to the 1820s and the 1830s, but that might have been associated not necessarily with the Tabby ruins, but with those kind of successive rancho operations.
Este es el punto donde se cree que varios ranchos estuvieron, especialmente el de William Bunce. Bunce fue un hombre de negocios y capitán. En 1844 se ubicó aquí al río Manatee y tomó posesión de un rancho. Estas ruinas de Tabby son evidencia no solo del rancho de Bunce, pero también de previos ranchos. El material de las ruinas está compuesto de una mezcla de arena, caracoles, caliza y agua, creando un tipo de cemento. Se piensa que fue construida alrededor de los 1820. We made our way back to Perico Preserve to continue our tour. Volvimos de vuelta a Perico a seguir nuestra discusión.
So what type of challenges or obstacles were the rancho settlements facing? ¿Qué tipo de obstáculos o dificultades tenían estos ranchos cubanos?
Sure. So you can imagine you would face a lot of obstacles living kind of on a frontier, you know, far away from kind of a seat of government or a population center. They were out in the sticks, and you know, the ranchos were these kind of frontier occupations, these frontier settlements. And so they faced a lot of natural obstacles, natural environment, you know, challenges. Just can imagine 1700s, 1800s Florida. There wasn't a lot of mosquito control. They were, you know, facing probably some pretty nasty storms and weather that came through, especially when they became year-round. You know, they were here and positioned, and so they had to make sure that all of their gear and their equipment, which, you know, was their livelihood, in order to get that salted and procured fish back to the market, had to make sure that that was stowed away during hurricane season so they didn't lose a lot of those assets.
Así que los ranchos cubanos pasaron muchos obstáculos para poder adaptarse a vivir aquí en la Florida. No solo era un nuevo lugar para explorar, tenían que saber cómo navegar, dónde encontrar esos peces, pero antes no había ni siquiera control para los mosquitos o los insectos, así que había un sol arduo, insectos por todas partes y nuevos animales que no conocían.
What factors led to the decline of the Cuban ranchos? ¿Qué elementos llevaron al descenso del rancho cubano?
For kind of easy purposes, we think that it began in 1780, and then right around 1840 is when, you know, it kind of signals the end. And Kind of the major event that really occurred up here in the Tampa Bay region, and it was part of the undoing of Bunce's Rancho. William Bunce originally set up shop here on the Manatee River, where there seems to be kind of a long occupation of a rancho operation with various owners and kind of head operators. And then he moved his operations up to Mullet Keys, which are on the north side of the mouth of Tampa Bay, north of Egmont. And in 1840, again with the political pressure that was coming down from the United States government as part of the Seminole War operations, these rancho locations and these rancho operations were really seen as places where the people who the United States Army were trying to remove from Florida were finding safer refuge. And so they were kind of seen as the other or as the enemies. And ultimately in 1840, Bunce's Rancho was raided and burned to the ground. It had been raided once before where over 100 women and children were removed and shipped to New Orleans, excuse me. And there was a petition even after that by a number of Spanish fishermen, or these Spanish Indians, the people who worked and lived among these ranchos, pleading to the United States government, this is all we've known, this is our home. We are mixed blood, but we're not Indians, we're rancho people, this is what we do. But, of course that went nowhere, and really at 1840, at that raid of Bunce's Rancho, which he had just passed away, but his rancho continued on, really kind of signals the end of the rancho period. The trade continued just here and there with different settlers and people of Cuban or Spanish descent, kind of continuing that trade with Cuba, but it was never seen as quite the size of industry kind of size as it had been during that 1780 to 1840 time period.
Claro, después de los 1840 llegó el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, y al venir el gobierno de los Estados Unidos llegó el presidente Jackson, que tenía un odio de la gente indígena, y pasó la ley de la remoción de los indígenas, y los ranchos se veían como un lugar en donde se mezclaban todas estas razas española e indígena, y hasta esclavos fugitivos, y se convirtieron en un target, en un obstáculo para el gobierno, donde pensaban que se escondían todos los indígenas, y empezaron a remover toda esta gente indígena, aunque estas personas que trabajaban en los ranchos era la única vida que conocían. Estos ranchos era toda su vida, habían nacido, vivido y estado en los ranchos por muchos años. Many of the early settlers only had a few materials to work with to build their homes. So what did their houses look like?
A lot like this that we see from some older postcards and some older pictures, but even from the historical records, this is some of the descriptions of what their residences or the places that they built and lived in may have looked like. So just thatched huts with wooden poles holding up the structure, and thatched with palmetto and palm fronds on the top.
Muchos de los hogares de los habitantes de los ranchos se veían un poco como donde nos sentamos ahora mismo, y estaban compuestos de postes de madera y techos hechos de palmetto o paja o gramas que encontraban a sus alrededores, porque solamente tenían los materiales que tenían a sus alrededores para poder construir sus casas. Thank you for joining us here today at Perico Preserve to learn a bit more about the Cuban Rancho settlements. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Gracias por unirte a nosotros para aprender un poco más sobre los ranchos cubanos. Puedes visitar Perico Preserve cualquier día.
Thanks for joining us to learn more about Cuban Ranchos. For more videos, please visit our Facebook or YouTube page at Manatee County Parks and Natural Resources. Gracias por ver nuestros videos para aprender más sobre los ranchos cubanos. Para más videos, visite nuestra página de Facebook o YouTube a Manatee County Parks and Natural Resources.